Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar on Qt Design Studio 1.0 and ready to go. During the session, if you have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A button at the top of the interface. Those questions will be answered at the end. This webinar will also be recorded and you will receive a copy of it delivered to your email account after the session. Hope you enjoy. And now I'll hand over to our experts, Thomas Hartmann and Vikas Pachdha. Over to you guys.
Hello, this is Thomas Hartmann. I'm here for Pachdha today, our product manager. He couldn't make it, unfortunately, today. And with me is Vikas. He's a senior developer for the Qt company, and he's working on the Photoshop bridge. And we will introduce Qt Design Studio 1.0 today. So yeah, I already introduced Vikas. He's working on the Photoshop bridge, and I'm Thomas Hartmann, and I'm the lead engineer on the Qt Design Studio. And yeah, for today's agenda, I will give a short intro. I will give an overview about what is Qt Design Studio 1.0, what is the vision, and so on and so on. And then we will give a hands-on demonstration. Vikas will start with that, with the Photoshop bridge. And then I will give a feature overview of the Design Studio itself. The Photoshop bridge is the Photoshop exporter from Photoshop, and then we will do a Q&A session in the end. Yeah. The whole idea between Qt Design Studio is to enhance the workflow between designers and developers when it comes to UI development, specifically with QML. So traditionally, you have many tools on the UI design side. Yeah, most prominent for this webinar would be Photoshop, but there are also others like Illustrator, there's Sketch, many of these tools which are used to design UIs. And then this is handed over to front-end developers and developers that then are responsible for implementing this and yeah, also deploying and testing in the end. And this creates many problems. One of the biggest problems is that you have a huge amount of specifications in Photoshop, PDF, PowerPoint, whatever, and this has to be turned, in our case, into QML by hand. And this is something where we want to help. We help with exporting automatically from Photoshop to QML, so you have a rough base that you can start to work on, and then we provide visual tooling, the Qt Design Studio, to continue to work on the QML and Qt Quick without coding knowledge. Basically, you are already able to deploy it to devices. You have a live preview, so a designer and front-end developer can basically work with a similar workflow that he's known in his tools and continue and refine the UI, and then that what is handed over to a developer is basically already at least a functional prototype, and this means there is a lot less requirement on specifications, and this allows, of course, a lot faster workflow, a lot faster turnaround times, and in the end makes development a lot cheaper. At least this is what we hope and promise. Right. And yeah, one of the big features we added is the timeline that allows pixel perfect animation with easy to use tools. And yeah, I think the rest are already mentioned. This is the roadmap. So we are now in 2018, end of 2018, and we have the Photoshop bridge, we have the live preview, we have a timeline and animation editor, we have QML visual effects that you can use by drag and drop. We have our own component shape items. I will go into detail later. We have a state editor, and yeah, we have project templates and the wizards, of course. And for the next year on the roadmap, we have integrating deeply with Qt 3D Studio. We have more bridges, most specifically Sketch. And we plan to have far more advanced state management, data model integration, UI flow navigation. So basically, we want to provide far more visual tools to make the UI interactive. We are thinking about Git support with a very easy and intuitive workflow, so it becomes possible for designers to use Git and use Git to collaborate with the developers. Then we are thinking about annotations and guidelines. That means you can annotate the documents with lines, grids, guidelines that are not part of the final delivery of the QML code, but are persistent. So you can have a backdrop image, things like that. And we are planning to design an ecosystem and a community to create one. Yeah, maybe even third-party plugins. Let's see. And yeah, we're of course always happy to get customer feedback, and the whole roadmap as of today is based on customer feedback from key customers mostly. So before we get started, let me just announce that we plan to release Qt Design Studio 1.0 hopefully this week, most likely end of this week. If everything goes well, you can basically download it end of this week, hopefully Friday. So now I will hand over to Vikas, and he will show you the Photoshop bridge.
Hello guys, this is Vikas, and I will present the Photoshop plugin for Qt Design Studio. It's called Qt Bridge, and I will talk about why this is made and what benefits it have, and what is the workflow, how to use it, and a little bit some tricks and some developers' perspective, how to use it to generate more efficient QML, which you can, iterate over, make your designs more flexible, and change the designs with time, which is very common. And that's the whole idea behind this whole workflow, that you can design a prototype, you can rework on it, you can re-import into QML, and you can do it over and over again, which is very difficult with the traditional approach where you have to get the documents from the designers and translate into QML. And this takes quite some time because you have to slice all the assets, and you have to collaborate those assets into QML, and it's a lengthy process. And on top of it, when design changes happens, then you have to do this whole process again and again. It consumes the time from the designer, from the developer, and that's our target, that we want to reduce this effort, make this process automated. We want to automate this process, and so that it's quite easy to make design changes. So that's the whole idea behind this Photoshop bridge. We started with the Photoshop first because that's the most widely used design application. And Thomas already talked about this, that in the future we will have more design application integrated into this ecosystem. We are already thinking about it, and we are already evaluating which design application makes sense to be part of this ecosystem. So as you can see, this is Qt Bridge. So when you install your Design Studio on your laptops or on your work machines, it will come with this Photoshop plugin. You have to install this Photoshop plugin. The instructions will come with the installer, so you can go through it and install it. And once you have installed, there are a few steps that you have to follow to make it work. So once you have installed the Photoshop plugin, and there are a few things that you have to do to enable this plugin. One thing is called remote connections. You have to enable remote connections, and you have to set up a remote connection password. And that password that you set in the preferences, which unfortunately I'm not able to show you guys, you have to use the same password in the settings of Photoshop. So in the preferences, the first thing you do after installing the Qt Bridge plugin is you go to Preferences and Plugins settings, and you enable this remote connection right here. And you put in a password right here, and This can be any password actually. So just choose whatever you want. And after that, you have to go to Windows, and extensions, and you will find the Qt Bridge extension already there. You launch it. So I already have launched it, so it's there, but for you it will, and then you can drag the window wherever you like. I like it here. So once you have Qt Bridge running, just open it. Go to open your desired PST. This is the example that I'm presenting today. And the first thing that you do is go to settings and type in your password that you put it in the Photoshop's preferences. And you can do a dry run to connect. For me, connection is successful because I have already punched in the password. And when you open a PST, so the idea is like you create your PST, and from this PST, the assets will be taken and it will be sliced and they will be named accordingly, and a whole KML will be generated around it. So the Qt Bridge plugin not only exports the assets, it also takes the structure from the PST itself. So the structure that you defined in the PST is also reflected in the KML. So when you are designing your PST, your layers, your groups, and your artboards, this will all translate to KML. So you have to follow some rules, and you have to make these components, make these folders and these layers in a way that you want the KML to look like. So there is a learning curve behind it, but not a big one. It's very intuitive. I can show you right now like how this will work, how you have to structure it, and how you have to tell the bridge that, okay, this is my asset, or this layer will turn up into a component, or this layer will turn up into a text or something like that. So I'll just go through it. But before that, once you open your PST, you also tell that where this export will happen, where these images will go into. So you can see here that you have this export path. You can set any path over here, wherever you want the exported asset to go. Otherwise, you can keep it default, or you can reset your chosen path, and the export will happen parallel to your PST. So if your PST name is like xyz.pst, a folder named xyz will be created just in that directory, and everything will be exported right there. So this is about the settings that you have to do before you start your work on the layers and all that stuff.
Maybe one thing that is worth mentioning is that we do not export directly to QML, but into an intermediate format.
Yes.
That means you can iteratively export like 5 or 10 Photoshop files, and then in one go you can import or re-import them later in the Qt Design Studio.
Exactly. So this folder will actually contain all your image assets and a metadata file, which will contain information about what to do with those images, and all the metadata that you have provided with all the layers and all the groups. So you can do as many times as you want this export, and after that, once you're done with your thing, your design is kind of okayish, and then you can import this metadata into Qt Design Studio, where all the KML generation will happen. And there is one more property that I would like to show you guys, is like what kind of assets you want to create with this. By default, the assets are created as PNG, but you can add many more formats. You can have JPEGs, and you can also have which scale settings you want with the assets. Currently, we support only 1x and 2x scale settings, and the export format is into PNGs or JPEGs. But depending on the feedback, we will add more, as you know. It all depends on the customer feedback actually. So once you're done with the settings, you go to the home screen, and this is what your properties look like on Photoshop. So this is my document. So let's say we want to make a music player, and this is how I started with it, and this is how I have structured the whole PSD document. You can see, like, first thing first, like, you have to design your PSD into artboards. You have to use artboards to make it work, and that's a prerequisite that you have to have. Groups or layers directly in the PSD documents may or may not work. So it's always recommended to use artboards. So that's what I have done. This is my main artboard that I created, one artboard. This is just an example screen, just one screen of the application. So if you want to make more, you can select your artboard, and you can add more artboards to it. It's fairly simple. So like this, I have created one more artboard and stuff like that. So let's work on the artboard that I have created. So if I go in the layers layout, you see this is my artboard right here. And I have created some components right below it. I can hide and show what thing is what. So this is the main action bar. I have tracks playing right here. I have control buttons, and I have like what's going to play next. And these are some artifacts that comes from the Android. So just for the developers help, I have just added those artifacts. Like this is where the Android bar will show where the batteries and your signals and the top bar shows. So just to include it as a reference. So in the Qt Bridge, now I will go through one by one each property of the that we can assign to a layer or a group, and what does it do. So I'll select the artboard first, and you can see oh yeah, there it is. You can see the layer name, its status bar, and by default, it will generate a KML ID that will be actually used in the generated KML. So by default, it just takes the layer name and transforms into a valid KML ID, and it appends the layer ID and the document ID behind that so that it's always unique. But you are free to change that, and it's recommended to change it to some meaningful name. And you can see the default one is like status bar 195, and this is the document ID behind that. And the next property is the export as, and this is the most important property in the Qt Bridge plugin. This is where you tell that what happened to this layer. So there are a few options to it, like component, then there is child, there is merged, and skipped. Some of the properties are disabled, and they do not apply to this particular layer. For example, artboard cannot be a child because artboards are always the top level components in KML. So in fact, in the PSD document also, artboards are the top level layers. So you cannot make child to something else. Then you have child property. A child property just tells that, okay, this layer is the child of its parent layer. When it comes handy, I will show you just right now. And there is one more property called merged. And this does the same thing what a merged layer does in Photoshop. The artifact is merged into its parent, so they become one asset. So if I have a group of 5 layers, and I set merged property to all those 5 layers, they will merge back to one asset of their parent and not 5 KML items in the generated KML. So I have used it in this PSD, and I will just show you how it works. And the skip is just skip it. Don't generate KML for this, which I'm using it for the bottom bar and the top bar because these controls are actually provided from the Android itself, so you don't need it. So, but it's there for the reference. And that's what I have done. If you see this status bar right here, and the property is export as skipped. So we don't want this layer in the generated KML. The same thing happens with the soft keys down below. You see the export type of this group, the whole group is skipped. So whatever their children are, like this, the back button here and the home screen, whatever it's the children of that group, they all will be skipped. And the next property that I want to talk about is as artboards. So this property is there where you have designed one component in your artboard and you want to reuse it. So all your artboards will be listed here. Unfortunately, I just have one artboard, so it's not there because you cannot use the same artboard inside the same artboard, otherwise it will be a chain. So but if I add one more artboard right here, so you can see that the next artboard is listed here. So I can use that artboard here. So the idea is that, let's say I want to create a button. So I create an artboard, I create a button out of it. Now I want to reuse this button everywhere in the other artboards. So I will give a decent name to it, like my custom button or something. And I will go to other artboards and I create a layer, probably a rectangle, which is best suited for this. So you create a rectangle and you go to the property of as artboard and you select a my custom button from this drop down. So what will happen is when you generate the KML from this PSD, the type of that layer will be your custom button that you have defined in that my custom button artboard. So by this property, you can reuse your artboards all over the PSD document, which is very natural to do because you will create like your buttons and your sliders and all that stuff into one artboard and reuse them everywhere else. But we have one more property called KML Type. So this is already an advanced use of Qt Bridge plugin. This is when you will use this property when you want to give a KML type to a layer, and that type is not part of this PSD. Let's say I want to create a mouse area on this button. So what you will do is you create a rectangle and you give the type to that rectangle as mouse area. So what will happen is when you generate this KML from the exported metadata, the type of this layer will be mouse area. And it will be the same dimensions that you have provided in the Photoshop PSD document. So you can use types that are not even present in this PSD document. You can use custom types, you can use KML controls, whatever type you can type, and you can provide here. So now when you give some custom types, there are also import statements tied to them. So for mouse area, there is none because there is already, it's part of KML 2. So what you do with your custom types is you give the type right here, and then you also type the import statement, like import my my custom plugin or something, and stuff like that. So once you do this, the import statement will also be part of this component. So this is what this property do. And then you have KML properties. When you are generating KML from this any layer or any group, you can also assign custom properties to it. I can say like int, you can say property int count to 5. So this property will be part of this layer and then generated KML. So you can assign properties, you can assign, even reuse the properties. I will just show you an example how it works. So this was the status bar. This is the your actual contents. You can see this is This is a component. Inside this, I have a close button right there, and some text, the track that's playing, and then I have created the shuffle button right here, which is again made up of four layers. And see, what I have done here is each layer is marked as merged. So primarily, I have defined the asset for this component into 4 layers, but I want it's still a one component. So I merged every layer back to this component, and see what I have done to the shuffle group. I have exported it as a child. So this shuffle button right here, I can just hide and show right here. So this will actually become the child of this artboard, or child of this component, the top component, which happens to be action contents. So the action contents is actually exported as component, and it has a button called shuffle, which is exported as child. And the shuffle button is made up of 3-4 layers, and each layer is marked as merged down. So this is how you will structure your PSD so that a meaningful KML comes out of it. And this is the same scenario happening with other groups that I have made, like this track group. You can see right here, it has 2 texts. And if you see the export type of the text, it's only 2 options available, as child or as skipped. Text cannot be merged down to its parent layer because it's a text, it's not an image. Only the assets can merge down back to its parent layer, not a text, because we are exporting this text layer as actual text in the KML, not as an image. So this will be a child to its parent component, and same happens with the author of this track. You can also change these KML ID right here, because by default it just takes the layer name and the document ID and the layer ID. So I can give a meaningful name to it, like singer or something. So this is the background layer, it's merged. And these are the controls right here. Controls are again made up of 3 next, forward, and buttons. So in this case, I don't want to merge them down. So I have exported them as child, because I want them to be as separate items in the generated KML. And now let's talk about clip components, clip contents, and create alias. So the idea is, like, we have, when you reiterate over KML and you want to reuse this KML component from outside world also, you want to add properties to it. And one common property is creating alias. So what happens is, if I say to this next button and say check this box as alias, what will happen? A property will be created in the parent component of this child, and it will be exported to the outside world. So you can basically use this KML from some other KMLs also, because this property is exported automatically. Even though you can write all the KML properties in this control right here, but alias is just a quick property that you can set right from here. Same goes with the clip contents, that if you want a generated KML to clip the contents of its children, then you can directly set here, right here. So let's do a trial export of what will happen. So all this, we are done with the design stuff, let's say, and where you just hit export. Now it's exporting it to the disk. So first of all, it just reads whatever settings we have there, and using those settings, it will start exporting assets out of it. And there is one thing important that we have to keep in mind is like when we are exporting, it's recommended not to fiddle around with your design, because whatever you do will actually eventually end up into the assets, generated assets and the metadata. So just wait for the export to finish, and after that you can work on your PSD. Unfortunately, it's really taking on quite some time. So while this is exporting, we can go to Qt Design Studio and do the prerequisite that we need for this exported metadata to be part of a project. So this is Qt Design Studio. This is how the main screen will look. So here I can say create a new project. So there are many more options over here. You want to create a journal, a mobile application, or desktop. So let's go with a journal, like what kind of settings are there. You have to give a name to your project, and let's say I will give a name called Music Player, a very unique name, and just hit next. Screen resolution you want with it, and just finish. For some reason, the laptop is really, really slow today. So this is the default project that you see. Powering. So this is a default project that is generated by the Qt Design Studio, and yeah. So I can just run it now, and you can see whatever default is there, like Hello Music Player. Export. Quite fast, and just hit export and everything is there. So now this is giving me a warning about metadata file already exists, because I exported before this session once, and so it's finding the metadata file already generated. So it's just asking like whether you want to overwrite the old generation or not. So yes, we'll just go ahead with this, and it will write the metadata. So I can show you where it is exported. You see, just right next to your PSD file, a folder will be created with the same name. And inside this folder, you will see all the assets that you have defined in your PSD, like which one will go where, component, child, or whatever is exported right here. And there is one more file called the metadata file, where all the information about how the layers, how the KML generation will work will be in part of this file. And this is what you import in the Qt Design Studio. So let's go to the Qt Design Studio part. There it is. And you go to edit. Then you go to resources right here. Then you have to add new resource. And right here you can select exported assets just to make it a bit faster. So in the desktop, we had this folder. Inside folder, we have this metadata file, right? So we'll just open it. So the dialog will be shown. So it just shows you like from where the KML will be generated and where the assets will be dumped. So you can change these paths right from this screen. So let's do the default thing and click the import button. So it's passing the metadata and importing all the assets into your project. So this point is writing KML and it's done. So you can see like from exporting from the Photoshop and importing in the Qt Design Studio, it's just a couple of minutes and you're done. So I'll just close it. And let's see how our music player looks like now. So I'll go to project right here, or you can go from here also, no problem. So this is my main screen, the artboard. So it's a bit big. I'll just make it a bit smaller so that whole of it is visible. So you see here, like whatever you have done in Photoshop, like Pixel Perfect is imported in as KML right in the Qt Design Studio right here. And I can go over, see, these are all each components. You can go in the navigator to see that all the components that are part of this KML. And if you want to see the code, generated code, it's right here. You can see the item is generated for the main artboard. Then you have main screen asset. Then you have all the button, the controls, the track, all the components that you have defined the PST, and their order is also preserved. It will look the same that you have exported right from there. I can also show you each components that have been exported. So let's go on the action bar. You can see right here that the shuffle button is there. See, when I told you guys that you can merge the assets and only one item will be generated in the Photoshop, that's the example of the shuffle button. So the shuffle button right here is just one asset. So all the layers that were merged back will generate just one button right here. So I can preview this my generated code right here. Let's go to the preview button right here, edit. Okay. So because the laptop resolution is much lower, so I'll just zoom it down to 33%, and you can see your camera is right here. And now the next example I will just show you about is like how to add custom stuff to it. So very quickly I will choose this button right here, and I will just create a rectangle on top of it. So rectangle right here, and I created a rectangle like this, and I will just name it Camel ID as a mouse area. And now I also want to export it as child because I want to create another item for this, and this will open up enable the controls to give special types to it. And the type that I give is mouse area. It spells wrong. Let me fix it. Mouse area right there. And in the properties, I can say on clicked, I just say console.log. Okay, I have to use different keyboard. Right there. That's even worse. Okay, Thomas, you have to help me with the German keyboard. So can you just yes, right there. So on clicked, that's it, and I'll just hit export. Yes, I want to overwrite. Done, go back, and in the resources, add new resources, go back to exported location, and okay, select metadata, no, not images, metadata. There it is, open, import. done. So you see, I got a dialog that the KML has changed because now it has overwritten on this stuff. So I'll just, where is that component? Action bar, right here. You see the mouse area is right here. And I'll just hit preview. We have to zoom it down. Say 50%. And in the application output, you can already say KML clicked. So that easily you can add custom types in Photoshop PSD. And you can iterate over this design over and over again, make new layers, make new groups, and change the properties and create new components, reuse the components, and all that stuff. And I hope this will reduce the time of this iteration by quite some factors. And now is this is time that I will give the stage to Thomas, who will explain the other features in the Qt Design Studio that you can use with this generated KML or the KML that you write yourself, and the new additions that we have done in the Qt Design Studio. Thomas.
Yes. Yeah, hello. Back again. So I open a small project that I created for the purpose of demonstrating a few features, and the first thing I will do now is I will add a new file, and I will add a Qt Quick UI file, a new file that we can start from scratch, and I call that meters for now. And then I click finish, and then I go back to the form editor, and I zoom to 100% again, or maybe 75%. So first, let me give a very, very rough overview about what we have in the Qt Design Studio 1.0. We have an item library, and we have a couple of nice flow tags for the most important imports. If you add an import, I will show that soon, you get more controls that you can add to the project and to your form. Then, of course, we have a form editor, a property editor that allows you to edit all the properties of items. We have a connection editor that I will briefly describe. We have a states editor where we have different states, and we have a timeline. This file, of course, doesn't have a timeline. Then we have the navigator that shows all the items, and we have the project tree. And the idea is to create a very simple meter that we take the design from one of our videos that were advertising in Qt Studio. So it's basically the rough design is not driven by QML, but by those videos. And I will start by dragging in a rectangle. The rectangle by default is white, but I want it to be transparent. And then I give it a border of some width, let's say 12, and give the border a color, some gray, and make it a bit bluish maybe. And then we give it some nice size, not too big, not too small. And we increase the radius. So this is how it looks now. And maybe make it a bit bigger. Inside that thing, I want to have a meter, and for that, I add the Qt Studio controls import to my project, a components import by clicking on that flow tag. And now I have a couple of new items available in the item library. For example, the arc here, and I will drag that in. I have a white arc. And this white arc, I will make a bit bigger. And then I give it a significantly thicker stroke width. I let the arc begin at 10 degrees and end at, let's say, 310. And I give it the same color that we had here in the rectangle for the stroke. It's not filled by default. And yeah, now I move it to the center, or at least the horizontal center. And maybe we make it a tiny bit, a little bit thicker, maybe 12, not 112, just 12. Okay, and now I make a copy of that. And I position the copy below this one, and I make the copy white. And then I make the copy quite slim again by reducing the stroke width. And I make it, give it a dash. And also I make it a full circle by changing the begin and end values. Now it looks like that. And this thing I now make a bit smaller and position it correctly. So that is basically an indication of the full circle. And then I also add a nice label to it. Here, I center the label vertical and horizontally. I make it a bit bigger. I can make it white. And from now I call that label. And maybe I will make it a bit brighter. Now I have basically, without using Photoshop, we created this design from scratch. This is especially useful if you want to have dynamic content. And I will show shortly how to make this dynamic. And because the idea is that this arc is not static, but dynamic. And for this, we can't easily use PNGs, right? So we have our own dynamic components. Now I do this here. I move this thing into a separate component so I can reuse it later and create an interface for it. The component I call meter. So what changed now in this root document is that we just have the first meter called rectangle left. And yeah, this is now a component. And with F2 or from the context menu here, we can go inside that component. And now here you see basically our component again that I just created. And to this component now, I add a timeline by creating this. And in this case, I don't want the timeline to be animated. That's why I remove the animation again, and then I close it. But now what I want to do is I press the record button, and for frame 0, so we go to frame 0, I want the start of the arc and the end of the arc to be the same as the start, 10. And then I go to the last frame, 1000, and here I say, let's say 360. That's not the full arc. Let's assume that is done by design like that. I disable the record button again. And now if I drag this slider, you see that we basically have now a functioning meter already, right? That goes from 0 to 1000. And of course, here in the options, we could basically add any duration, but I just decided for 0 to 1000 for now. And now we do another nice thing. I select this timeline here and I export the current frame as a property alias. I will shortly explain what that means. And I will do the same for the caption of the label, the text of the label element, export property as alias. And now if I select the root element here in the properties connection editor, you see that it has two properties added to it. One is an alias to the current frame and one is an alias to the element. I will call this caption and the other one I call value. So, and now I go back to my original document where I have this component, and you see it changed a little bit. And now it has two new properties. Value, let's just enter 320 here. You see it works. And also label, which is a caption. And we call that, let's say, living room. Now I have basically this as a reusable component, and that's exactly what I will do. I copy it with copy and paste, move it to the left a bit, and then I change the value to something else, just for demonstration purposes, and I call that kitchen, for example, and I do another copy to the right, and here I call it sleeping room and give it another value. In reality, for a real project, those would be bindings to some backend object, but that's not what I want to show here. What I want to show here is now how to make this a bit more interactive. Now we have these three starting static meters, and I also want to use again the timeline to move them a bit around. And for that, again, I add a timeline. Again, I don't want an animation here, so I close it. And I go to the beginning. I press the record button again. I select my 3 meters. And now I move the kitchen thing to the center, because that's basically the first state that thing can be in. Then I go to 500. And I move back the living room thing to the center. And then I go to 1000. And I move the sleeping room to the center. Oops, yep, like that. And now I undo the recording. And now I remove all the keyframes for the Y properties that were added to this timeline, because I only want an animation for the X property. And now I can drag this frame handle a bit around, and you see that you have this slide effect already. So now let's add a couple of more keyframes. So we go to the beginning again. I select the kitchen, and now I add a keyframe for the opacity, just with the original value, and also a keyframe for the scaling. So that just means that the original value is like it was. Now I use the record button again, but for the other two, I set the opacity to, let's say, 0.4, and the scaling to 0.8. Oops. 0.8, and the opacity is supposed to be not but 4, and the same for this thing. So 0.4, and the scale is 0.8. Okay, and now we go to 500 again. And now you see that we have to edit it again a bit. So here we change the scaling to 0.8 and the opacity to 0.4, and here to 1 and 1. And now we go to the last state or frame where the sleeping room is in the middle, and we want this to be 1, this to be 1. Here we want it to be 0.8, and here we want it to be 0.2, right? And now I disable the recording again, and now you see I can drag this and I get this sliding effect. Now I want to make this a bit more interactive, and for this I add the controls to this small file. So now I have in my item library all our controls. I choose the slider, And I add the slider on the bottom here. And I say my slider, the default value is 500. Oops, 500. Okay. 5. What the fuck? 5. Why is my 5 working anymore? Okay, from and to 1,000. That at least works.
All right.
And, yeah, of course, I can't put it to 500 because that's out of range. Okay, now it works. So I have now a slider from 500, 0 to 1,000. Value is 500. Now the trick is I have this timeline here and I have the current frame, and I set a binding here. I say slider dot, oops, not with caps, slider dot value, oops, value, that's it. And now I run that in the live preview. And you see, this is now logically connected. So I can drag the slider to move those items. And what I want to do now is I make this slider a bit bigger. That's kind of a hack, but in the future, we will look into that. And then I set the opacity to 1.0, not 0, because then it would not get events anymore. And for the future, we are looking into having lots of these invisible controls to make these kind of touch events easy mappable to the timeline. And now I basically have this behavior. I can basically drag in the meter I want to the middle. And this, of course, that's the very beginning. We could do a lot more. But I think this gives you a good impression of what you can do with the timeline and what's possible. I want to show you a few more small examples. So I have this check UI here. Just want to run that. So just to give you an idea what's possible with the timeline, we have this really nice animated UI, which is more prototype, but you can basically develop that in our tool and refine it, and then slowly and gradually turn it into a real product. And you see that the animations of this thing are already quite complex, but we can easily handle that in the tooling and in QML. So this is, as you see, quite a big file. And one more example is this boot up animation. So I will run it first so we get an idea what this is. So it's also a meter, a gauge, and it has a nice boot up animation. And then it basically runs. There's one more small feature I want to show here that we added for 1.0 is that you can map different states. So we have the base state, the boot up state, and the running state. And in each state, different timelines are active. And for different timelines, also different animations are active. And by default, we're in the boot up state where we have the boot up timeline that defines the animation for the boot up animation. And then we have the boot up animation which really drives that. We could also run it reverse and defines the duration. And when that one is finished, we can basically specify that here we go to the running state. And in the running state, another timeline is active, which basically then just moves the value. Yes. Yeah, I hope this gave you a really good impression of what you can do with the tooling. And yeah, now I think we come to the QA questions.
Yes, we are already a little bit over, so we literally have time for 2 more questions. We have about 1 minute. And for the rest of the questions, we don't get to them, we'll answer them by email privately. So
okay.
Don't worry.
Yeah, maybe Vikas, you want to answer those questions.
So how is it that the question is like how this is different from the scripts that we already had in the beginning for Photoshop, GIMP, and Illustrator? The scripts that we had was like very static. So you can just dump out the assets out of the Photoshop, and that's about it. With this plugin, primarily you can decide what happens with each layer, what happens with each group, and how the generated QML will look like, whether this layer will be a component or this. You can already structure the QML and add properties to your PSTs. And after that, you can pass around this PST between your designers or your UI developers. So this plugin does much more than what these scripts did. And this will also scale to other design applications as well, where you can collaborate with all those design applications like Sketch or all the other design applications, which will be integrated into this ecosystem, and you can use all the benefits of these design application into your KML. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, and there was a question about the SVG path. The SVG path I didn't show yet, but the answer is kind of yes. The SVG path is created by runtime. It's not pre-generated, and it basically allows you to have a QML item and then define the path in as just a string from the SVG, and then it's basically triangulated and rendered on the GPU. This is still a bit like work in progress, but at least the SVG path item already we have, and we would like to do more in that direction. But yeah, I think it's already quite useful item. So for the future, we think that it would be very useful to be able to copy and paste shapes from, for example, Illustrator just over to the Design Studio. Also support this better when exporting from other tools. Yeah, I already tried to show a little bit of the code. So the timeline basically generates keyframes. So it's basically a keyframe-based animation tool. Yeah, there's no magic about it. If you have like a complex document like you have here, you have, of course, lots and lots and lots of keyframes, but that's how it is. Then there's a question how hard it would be to add touch events to this example. Yeah, I mean, the mouse area is more or less supported, and when you basically can change states and react to the click events, but we still want to improve on that and have building blocks that make it easy to also define really complicated behavior easily and map that, for example, to a timeline or another pre-generated component. Yeah, then there's a question for having the different states, like enabled, disabled, highlighted, and so on. This is something we will currently look into. I hope we will soon support that, at least for things like push buttons and so on, that you can create push buttons with different states.
So primarily, yeah, as of now, with the current Qt Bridge, what you can do is you can generate assets for your all different states. And when you import your stuff into the Photoshop, then you can program your KML to use this state according to like whenever this button is disabled or enabled. The idea is like the Photoshop Bridge is just a tool which enables you to take your assets and your structure from PST and create KML out of it. If you want to, you cannot, this is not meant to design your KML directly. For that, you still have to use Qt Design Studio to use all the powerful features of the designer. So I think we cannot put all the stuff into the Photoshop Bridge, but the idea behind Bridge is just to reduce the time from generating assets from PST and generating the basic structure around it. So I think that Photoshop Qt Bridge does very well. And of course, we'll look into the more possibilities that and the feedback we'll get from you guys, and we'll try to incorporate that back into the plugin itself.
Okay, I think that's about time we have today, unfortunately. I know there's a few more questions, so we'll get back to those people who have asked them after this webinar privately. But thank you so much for joining. If you do come up with any more questions, please send them over to info@qt.io and we'll answer them for you as well. Until then, I wish you a great day, and until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you from my side for joining.
Yeah, thanks for your time.
Yep. See you.